What if I told you that there was a woman who was forced to have 23 children over 25 years? That every single pregnancy was documented like livestock breeding records? That only 12 of those children survived past age 10? And that every single one of those surviving children was sold away from her? That woman's name was Lucy, and her story, preserved in plantation records discovered over 150 years after her death, represents the most thoroughly documented case of forced reproductive exploitation in American history. This is not a story about statistics. This is not a story about abstract systems. This is a story about one woman, one life, 23 pregnancies, 25 years of her body being used as a factory for producing children who would be enslaved. And what makes Lucy's story particularly important is that we have the records. We have the plantation owner's ledger, where he tracked every pregnancy. We have his calculations of profit from each birth. We have his notes about which children survived and which didn't. We have his records of when each child was sold and for how much. These records were discovered in 2015 in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. A historian researching plantation economics found a ledger book from a breeding plantation in Goochland County, Virginia. And in that ledger, among the financial records and crop yields and equipment purchases, there was a section dedicated to tracking the reproductive output of enslaved women, and one name appeared more than any other: Lucy. 23 pregnancies documented between 1830 and 1855. 25 years of forced reproduction, all recorded in cold, clinical detail by the man who owned her. For the next hour, we're going to explore Lucy's story. We're going to look at what those plantation records reveal. We're going to talk about what it meant to be valued, not for your labor, but for your reproductive capacity. We're going to discuss the physical toll of 23 pregnancies. We're going to examine the psychological trauma of having every single surviving child taken from you. And we're going to connect Lucy's individual story to the broader system of forced breeding that we've discussed in previous episodes. Because Lucy's story isn't unique in what happened to her. Thousands of enslaved women experienced similar exploitation. What makes Lucy's story unique is that we have documentation. We have proof. We have the actual records that show exactly how systematic this was, how calculated, how coldly economic. And those records force us to confront the reality that this wasn't occasional cruelty. This was business. This was an investment strategy. This was profit maximization. And Lucy's body was the resource being exploited. Before we dive into Lucy's specific story, I need to set some context. Because to understand what happened to Lucy, you need to understand the economics of the breeding plantation system that we discussed in our first episode. After 1808, when the United States banned importing enslaved people from Africa, plantation owners in the Upper South, particularly Virginia and Maryland, increasingly focused on producing enslaved children for sale to the expanding cotton plantations in the Deep South. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't secret. This was an acknowledged economic sector. Plantation owners openly discussed breeding strategies. They tracked reproductive rates. They calculated natural increase the way farmers calculated the growth of their livestock herds. And some plantations, particularly in Virginia, became specialized breeding operations where producing children for sale was the primary business model. Lucy lived on one of these specialized breeding plantations. The plantation owner, whose name we know from the records, but I'm not going to use because this story isn't about him, it's about Lucy. This owner operated what historians now call a breeding farm. He owned about 30 enslaved women of childbearing age and about 20 enslaved men. His plantation didn't produce significant amounts of tobacco or cotton. His crop was children. His business was buying young enslaved women, ensuring they became pregnant regularly, and then selling their children once they reached age 8 to 10. And Lucy was apparently one of his most valuable assets. Not because of any work she did in the fields, not because of any skills she possessed, but because her body produced children regularly, and those children tended to survive. From an owner's perspective, from a purely economic calculation, Lucy was a highly productive investment. From Lucy's perspective, from the perspective of her lived experience, she was trapped in a nightmare that lasted 25 years. The ledger entries start in 1830. Lucy would have been around 15 or 16 years old. The first entry reads, Lucy, first child born, male, healthy. Value estimated at $400 by age 8. That's how the owner documented the birth of Lucy's first child. Not as a human event, not as a mother bringing new life into the world, but as a financial projection, a calculation of future profit. That baby boy, Lucy's first child, he's not given a name in this entry. He's just recorded as male child, value $400. Over the next 2 years, there are no pregnancy entries for Lucy. Then in 1832, Lucy, second child born, female, sickly. The word sickly appears multiple times in this ledger when referring to children who were born with health problems or who seemed unlikely to survive. And indeed, a few months later, there's another entry. Lucy's female child died age 4 months. Loss of potential value. The owner recorded the death of Lucy's baby girl as a loss of potential value, not as a tragedy, not as a mother's grief. As a financial loss. Can you imagine? Can you imagine having your baby die and knowing that the person who controlled your life saw that death not as something to mourn, but as a financial setback? Can you imagine the rage, the helplessness, the grief compounded by the knowledge that your child's life was only valued in dollars? But the entries continue. 1834, Lucy, third child born, male, healthy. 1836, Lucy, fourth child born, female, healthy. 1838, Lucy, fifth child born, male, healthy. On and on, year after year, pregnancy after pregnancy. Each one documented with the same clinical language, each one calculated in terms of future profit. By 1840, Lucy had given birth to 7 children. 4 had survived past infancy. And here's where the ledger reveals something particularly disturbing. In 1840, there's an entry, sold Lucy's first male child, age 10, to trader for $650. Good profit. Lucy's first baby, the one born in 1830, he would have been 10 years old in 1840. Old enough to work, old enough to be valuable, old enough to be sold. And the owner sold him to a trader who would have taken that boy to the deep south, to the cotton plantations of Mississippi or Louisiana. And Lucy would never see her son again. She would never know what happened to him, whether he survived, whether he was treated well or badly, whether he ever thought of her. Nothing. Just the knowledge that her first child, the baby she had given birth to at 16, was gone. Sold. For profit. And this pattern repeats. The ledger shows sales of Lucy's children at regular intervals. As each child reached age 8 to 10, when they became valuable enough to sell, they were sold. 1842, sold Lucy's female child, age 8, for $550. 1844, sold Lucy's male child, age 8, for $600. Each sale documented, each profit calculated, each child taken from their mother. Now I need to pause here and talk about what this meant physically for Lucy. Because 23 pregnancies over 25 years, that's not normal, that's not healthy. That's pushing the human body to its absolute limits. The average time between Lucy's pregnancies, based on the ledger dates, was just over 1 year, which means Lucy was pregnant almost constantly for 25 years. Think about that. From age 16 to age 40, Lucy was either pregnant, recovering from childbirth, or nursing an infant. For 25 years. Modern medical understanding tells us how dangerous this is. Closely spaced pregnancies put enormous stress on a woman's body. Each pregnancy depletes the mother's nutritional reserves. If she doesn't have adequate time to recover between pregnancies, her health deteriorates. Her bones lose density because the developing fetus takes calcium. Her iron levels drop because the fetus needs iron for blood development. Her body is constantly giving resources to developing babies without time to replenish those resources. And remember, Lucy wasn't receiving good nutrition. She wasn't getting prenatal care. She wasn't resting during pregnancy. Enslaved women on breeding plantations were still required to work. They still labored in the fields or in the house. They were still subject to the same demands as non-pregnant enslaved people, at least until very late in pregnancy. Some owners would give pregnant women slightly reduced workloads in the final months of pregnancy, not out of compassion, but because they didn't want to risk losing their investment. The physical toll of 23 pregnancies would have been devastating. Lucy's teeth would have likely deteriorated or fallen out because of calcium depletion. Her bones would have weakened. She would have likely suffered from chronic anemia, leaving her constantly exhausted. She might have developed various complications that were common with repeated pregnancies. Uterine prolapse, where the uterus drops into the vaginal canal because the supporting muscles and ligaments have been overstretched. Incontinence, because repeated childbirth damages the pelvic floor muscles. Chronic pain in her back and joints. Varicose veins from the repeated pressure of pregnancy, and these would have been permanent conditions. After 25 years of nearly constant pregnancy, Lucy's body would have been broken. At age 40, she would have been physically destroyed by the demands that had been placed on her reproductive system. But the ledger doesn't record any of this. The ledger doesn't mention Lucy's health except in relation to her ability to produce more children. As long as she could get pregnant and carry children to term, her physical suffering was irrelevant to the man who owned her. Now let's talk about the births themselves. Because the ledger mentions that 12 of Lucy's 23 children died before age 10. Most of those deaths occurred in infancy or early childhood, which means Lucy experienced the death of 12 of her children. 12 times she gave birth to a baby and then watched that baby die. From disease, from malnutrition, from the harsh conditions of slavery, from the inadequate medical care available to enslaved people. Infant and child mortality was high under slavery, much higher than among free populations. Enslaved babies often weren't getting adequate nutrition because their mothers weren't getting adequate nutrition. They weren't receiving medical care when they got sick. They were exposed to diseases. They lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. And they were subject to a system that didn't prioritize their survival unless they showed signs of being economically valuable. Some of the ledger entries are heartbreaking in their clinical detachment. 1837, Lucy's female child died age 2, fever. 1843, Lucy's male child died age 1, undetermined cause. 1847, Lucy's male child stillborn. Each death recorded as simply as a crop failure or a broken tool, just a loss of potential profit. No acknowledgement of the mother's grief. No recognition that Lucy had to bury 12 of her children, that she had to experience the specific agony of losing a child not once, but 12 times. Think about what that does to a person. 12 pregnancies that ended in death. 12 children that Lucy carried, gave birth to, nursed, cared for, loved, and then lost. And she had no time to grieve because she would be pregnant again within a year. The psychological trauma of this is almost impossible to comprehend. The constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, loss, pregnancy, birth, loss. No space to heal, no time to mourn. Just the relentless biological exploitation continuing year after year. But then there's another dimension to Lucy's suffering that might have been even worse than the deaths. The 11 children who survived were all sold away from her. Every single one. The ledger documents each sale, the dates, the prices, the names of the traders or buyers. And those sales meant permanent separation. Once a child was sold to a trader who would take them to the Deep South, Lucy would never see them again. Never know what happened to them. Never be able to protect them, or comfort them, or tell them she loved them. Historians who study slavery talk about family separation as one of the most traumatic aspects of the system. Enslaved people formed families. They loved their children fiercely. They created bonds and communities. And then those bonds were violently severed for profit. Parents were sold away from children. Children were sold away from parents. Siblings were separated. And the people being separated had no power to prevent it, no ability to stay in contact, no hope of reunion. For Lucy, this separation happened 11 times. 11 of her children survived past infancy, only to be sold away from her when they reached age 8 to 10. Can you imagine? Can you imagine spending 8 or 9 years with your child, nursing them through illnesses, teaching them, loving them, creating whatever small moments of joy were possible within the horror of slavery, and then having them taken, sold, gone, knowing you would never see them again, never know if they were safe or suffering, never be able to comfort them when they were scared or hurt, just gone, and then being pregnant again within months because your owner wanted more children to sell. The ledger gives us the dates, but not the emotions. We can calculate that Lucy was separated from her surviving children at roughly 2-year intervals, which means just as she was recovering from one separation, adjusting to the grief of losing another child, she would be approaching the time when her next oldest child would reach selling age, living under that constant dread, knowing that every child she had would eventually be taken from her, knowing that loving them meant setting herself up for another devastating loss. Some historians argue that enslaved mothers tried to protect themselves emotionally by not bonding too deeply with their children, that knowing the children would be taken, some mothers maintained emotional distance as a survival strategy. But the testimonies we have from formerly enslaved people suggest this wasn't really possible. Mothers loved their children. They couldn't help it. They couldn't protect themselves from that love, even when they knew it would mean suffering. So they loved their children intensely, and then suffered intensely when those children were taken. And Lucy experienced this 11 times. 11 pregnancies that resulted in children who survived long enough to bond with her and then were sold away. 11 devastating separations, plus 12 deaths, 23 losses in 25 years. It's hard to imagine how a person survives that psychologically. How do you keep going? How do you not break completely? Now let's look at some specific entries from the ledger that reveal more about how this system operated. In 1845, there's an interesting entry: Lucy refusing to eat, requiring medical attention. Cost of doctor, $5. This is the only entry in the entire 25-year period that mentions Lucy herself rather than her pregnancies or her children. And it's revealing. Lucy stopped eating. She required medical attention. The owner had to pay a doctor. This suggests Lucy was engaging in a form of resistance. Refusing food is one of the few ways enslaved people could exert some control over their bodies. It's a form of protest, a way of saying, "I won't cooperate." And the fact that it required medical attention suggests Lucy was serious about it. She wasn't just skipping a meal. She was engaging in what we would now call a hunger strike. But notice how the entry frames it. The concern isn't Lucy's well-being. The concern is the cost of the doctor. $5. That's what the owner cared about. Not why Lucy was refusing to eat. Not what suffering had driven her to this. Just the cost of getting her back to functioning so she could continue producing children. The entry doesn't tell us what happened after the doctor's visit. But within a year, there's another entry documenting Lucy's next pregnancy. So presumably the owner found a way to force Lucy back into compliance. This is one of the only glimpses we get in the ledger of Lucy as a person rather than as a reproductive resource. One moment where her resistance, her refusal, her agency breaks through the clinical documentation. And even that moment is recorded only as a cost to the owner. But it tells us something important. Lucy resisted. At least once in 1845, after 15 years of forced pregnancies and multiple separations from her children, Lucy said no. She refused. Even though she knew the consequences would be severe, even though she knew she would be forced back into compliance, she resisted. Another revealing entry comes from 1850. Lucy's male child, age 8, showing promising strength, should bring premium price. The owner was evaluating an 8-year-old child, Lucy's child, in terms of market value. Looking at a boy, Lucy's son, and seeing dollar signs. Noting his strength, his health, his potential to command a premium price. This child was Lucy's 10th surviving child, which means Lucy had already lost 9 children by this point, 6 to death and 3 to sale. And now her 10th child was being evaluated for his market value. Think about what Lucy must have been feeling as her son was inspected, evaluated, discussed in terms of his price. Did she hope he would be assessed as less valuable, so maybe the owner would keep him longer? Or did she know that delaying the inevitable would just prolong the dread? The ledger shows this boy was indeed sold within the year, in 1851, for $750. Premium price, good profit. And Lucy lost another child. Let's look at the final entries in the ledger. 1854, Lucy, 22nd child born, female, weak. This was Lucy's second-to-last pregnancy. She was around 39 years old. After 24 years of nearly constant pregnancy, after giving birth to 21 children, After losing 17 of those children to death or sale, Lucy had her 22nd child, and that baby girl was described as weak. A few months later, Lucy's female child died aged 3 months. Lucy's 22nd child died in infancy. And then, the final entry, 1855, Lucy, 23rd child born, male, weak, born after 1 month, died after 2 days. This was Lucy's last pregnancy. She was about 40 years old. The baby was premature, born a month early, and he died 2 days after birth. After 25 years, after 23 pregnancies, after all the losses and grief and physical destruction, Lucy's final pregnancy ended with a premature baby who lived for 2 days. And then there are no more entries about Lucy. The ledger continues with entries about other enslaved women on the plantation. But Lucy's name disappears from the reproductive tracking section. Why? We don't know for certain. Maybe at age 40, after 23 pregnancies, Lucy could no longer conceive. Maybe her body was so broken that she couldn't carry a pregnancy to term. Maybe the owner decided she was no longer a valuable reproductive resource and sold her. Maybe she died. The ledger doesn't tell us. What we do know is that Lucy's 25 years of documented forced reproduction ended in 1855, and during those 25 years, she had been pregnant 23 times. She had given birth to 23 children. 12 of those children died before age 10. 11 survived long enough to be sold away from her. At the end of those 25 years, Lucy had no children with her. Every single one was gone, dead or sold. She had spent 25 years producing children and had nothing. No family, no children, just a broken body and unimaginable trauma. Now I want to talk about what this ledger tells us about the broader system, because Lucy's story, as individually tragic as it is, represents a pattern. The historian who discovered this ledger found similar records for other enslaved women on the same plantation. Not all had as many pregnancies as Lucy, but all were tracked the same way. All were valued for their reproductive capacity. All had their pregnancies documented like livestock breeding records. All had their children sold away. This plantation wasn't unique. Historians have found similar records from other breeding plantations in Virginia and Maryland. The specific numbers vary. Some women had fewer pregnancies, some had more. But the pattern is consistent. Enslaved women on these plantations were expected to produce children regularly. Those children were tracked from birth. They were sold once they reached valuable age. And the whole process was documented as a business operation. What makes Lucy's case extraordinary isn't that it happened. What makes it extraordinary is that we have such complete documentation. 25 years of records. 23 pregnancies all documented, every child tracked, every sale recorded. This level of documentation is rare. Most breeding plantations didn't keep such detailed records, or if they did, those records haven't survived. So Lucy's ledger gives us an unusually complete picture of what forced breeding looked like at the individual level. And what that picture shows is a system of reproductive exploitation that was coldly calculating, brutally efficient, and completely dehumanizing. Lucy wasn't seen as a person. She was seen as a resource. Her body was a tool for producing valuable commodities. Her pregnancies were tracked like crop yields. Her children were inventory. And her suffering was completely irrelevant except when it interfered with production. This is what industrial-scale reproductive exploitation looked like. This is what it meant when we say that slavery turned women's bodies into factories. Lucy was a factory. For 25 years, producing children who would be enslaved and sold. And every aspect of that production was documented, calculated, and optimized for profit. Now let's connect Lucy's individual story to the broader economic system. We discussed in our first episode how the domestic slave trade operated, how traders would buy enslaved people in Virginia and Maryland and transport them to the Deep South for sale. How this trade was essential to the expansion of cotton production, how it generated enormous profits for traders and plantation owners. Lucy's children were part of that trade. The ledger shows that most of Lucy's children were sold to traders rather than to individual buyers, which means they were almost certainly taken to the Deep South. Sold at auction in New Orleans or Natchez, purchased by cotton plantation owners who needed labor. worked in the brutal conditions of cotton production. And Lucy would never know any of this. She would just know that her children were taken, that traders came and took them away. And they were gone. Think about what this means. Lucy's body was exploited to produce workers for cotton plantations. Her reproductive capacity was used to fuel the expansion of cotton production. The children she carried and gave birth to were raw materials for the cotton economy. This is how directly the breeding system connected to the broader economic structure of slavery. Breeding plantations in Virginia produced children. Those children were sold to cotton plantations in Mississippi. Cotton was produced and exported. Profits flowed to plantation owners and traders. And the whole system depended on the reproductive exploitation of women like Lucy. This is why we can't separate the breeding system from the economic system. They were integrated. The forced reproduction of enslaved women wasn't incidental to slavery's economics. It was central. After 1808, it was essential. Without the children produced by women like Lucy, the cotton economy couldn't have expanded the way it did. The domestic slave trade couldn't have operated. The whole system would have stagnated or collapsed. So when we look at Lucy's 23 pregnancies documented in that ledger, we're not just looking at one woman's suffering. We're looking at the human cost of cotton production. We're looking at the foundation of American economic growth in the mid-19th century. We're looking at the brutal reality behind the statistics about cotton exports and plantation profits. Behind every bale of cotton was labor, and behind the labor force was forced reproduction. And behind forced reproduction were women like Lucy. Now I need to address something that might be on your mind. Why am I focusing so much on this one woman? Why does Lucy's individual story matter when thousands of women experienced similar exploitation? And my answer is this: statistics are important. Understanding the scale and scope of forced breeding is important. But statistics can become abstract. When we talk about thousands of women experiencing forced reproduction, it's hard to really grasp what that meant at the individual level. Lucy's story matters because it's specific, because we have the records, because we can see exactly what 25 years of forced reproduction looked like for one woman. We can count the pregnancies, we can see the deaths, we can track the sales, we can calculate the profit. And in that specificity, we can better understand the human reality behind the system. Lucy represents thousands of other women, but she's not a statistic. She's a person whose life we can partially reconstruct from historical records. And her story helps us understand what those thousands of other women experienced. This is why historians value documents like this ledger, not because Lucy's experience was unique, but because it was typical. And the documentation allows us to understand that typical experience in detail. Most enslaved women who experienced forced breeding didn't leave records we can access. Their pregnancies weren't documented. Their children's fates weren't tracked. Their stories are lost to history. But Lucy's story survived. And in preserving and studying her story, we honor all the women whose stories didn't survive. Let me talk about what happened after 1855, after the ledger entries about Lucy stop. We know the Civil War began in 1861. We know the Emancipation Proclamation came in 1863. We know slavery was abolished with the 13th Amendment in 1865. But what happened to Lucy? Did she survive to see emancipation? Did she live to be free? We don't know. The ledger doesn't tell us. There are no further records of Lucy that historians have found. She disappears from the historical record after 1855. She would have been about 40 years old. If she survived another 10 years, she would have experienced emancipation at age 50. But we don't know if she survived. We don't know what her life was like in those final years of slavery, or in the early years of freedom if she lived to see them. What we do know is that if Lucy survived to emancipation, she would have been free but utterly alone. All of her children were gone, dead or sold to distant places. Even if slavery ended, even if those children were legally free, they were scattered across the South. Lucy would have had no way to find them, no way to know if they were alive, no way to reunite with them. Freedom would have meant being alive, but having lost everything and everyone. This is something we need to understand about emancipation. Freedom was essential. Freedom was necessary. But freedom didn't undo the damage. It didn't restore the families that had been torn apart. It didn't heal the trauma. It didn't give back the years of exploitation. Women like Lucy, if they survived to emancipation, they were free. But they were also broken, physically destroyed by years of forced pregnancy, psychologically traumatized by repeated losses, socially isolated because their families had been destroyed, free but damaged beyond repair. And there was no support system for these women, no counseling, no medical care for the physical damage, no help finding family members, no compensation for what had been done to them, just freedom, which was crucial but insufficient. The system had taken everything from women like Lucy, and emancipation gave them legal freedom, but nothing else, no resources, no support, no acknowledgement of what they had endured, just the status of no longer being property. Now let's talk about the man who owned Lucy, the man whose ledger documented her 25 years of exploitation. I haven't named him because I don't want this story to center him. This story is about Lucy, but I need to say something about him because understanding the people who operated these breeding plantations is important for understanding the system. This man wasn't a monster in the sense of being fundamentally different from other people. He was a businessman. He saw an economic opportunity in breeding enslaved people for sale. He invested in that business. He kept detailed records like any good businessman would. He tracked his inventory, calculated his profits, optimized his operations. From his perspective, he was just running a plantation efficiently. And that's what's so disturbing about this. The systematic reproductive exploitation of women like Lucy wasn't the work of uniquely evil individuals. It was the work of ordinary people operating within an economic system that treated humans as property. People who saw nothing wrong with forcing women to have 23 children because those children represented profit. People who recorded infant deaths as financial losses rather than tragedies. People who sold children away from their mothers and documented it as successful business transactions. The evil wasn't individual pathology. The evil was the system. The evil was a society that made this legal, profitable, and acceptable. The evil was an economic structure that incentivized this kind of exploitation. The evil was a legal framework that defined humans as property and gave owners complete power over them. And within that system, ordinary people did horrifying things and saw nothing wrong with it, and documented it in neat ledger books as proof of their business acumen. This is why we can't just blame individual slaveholders and call it a day. Individual slaveholders were responsible for their actions, but they were operating within a system, and that system was created and maintained by society, by laws, by courts, by economic structures, by cultural beliefs. The breeding plantation where Lucy was exploited existed because American society allowed it to exist, profited from it, depended on it. And the man who owned Lucy was able to operate his breeding business because he had the full support of the law and the economic system. So when we study Lucy's story, we're not just studying one woman and one cruel owner. We're studying what society permits, what economic systems incentivize, what happens when some humans are defined as property, what results when profit becomes the ultimate value. Lucy's 23 pregnancies are a window into how oppression operates at the systemic level. Let me connect this to contemporary issues. Because Lucy's story, as historical as it is, speaks to current debates. There are ongoing discussions about reproductive rights, about bodily autonomy, about who has control over pregnancy decisions. And while the specific context is completely different from slavery, while we're not comparing free women today to enslaved women, there are nonetheless some resonances worth noting. Lucy had zero control over her own reproduction. Zero choice about whether to become pregnant. Zero say in what happened to her children. Her body was used for reproduction against her will. This represents the extreme end of reproductive coercion, the complete denial of bodily autonomy. And while nothing in contemporary America approaches that extreme, the question of who controls reproduction, who makes decisions about pregnancy, who has bodily autonomy, these questions are still being contested. There are also resonances with discussions about commodifying pregnancy, about surrogacy, about reproductive technologies, about who has access to reproductive choice. Lucy's pregnancies were explicitly commodified. Her children were literally sold as property. Today we debate about the ethics of commercial surrogacy, about paying women to carry pregnancies, about the relationship between reproduction and economics. And while the context is completely different, studying Lucy's story can inform those debates. It can show us what happens when reproduction is purely economic, when children are valued only in terms of profit, when women's bodies are treated primarily as reproductive resources. There are also parallels to discussions about reproductive justice. That's a framework developed by Black feminists in the 1990s that talks about the right to have children, the right not to have children, and the right to raise children in safe environments. Lucy was denied all three of those rights. She was forced to have children she didn't choose to have. She was denied the ability to not have children, and she was prevented from raising her children in any kind of safe or stable environment. Her story illustrates what it looks like when all three components of reproductive justice are completely denied. And finally, there's the issue of historical accountability. Lucy's exploitation generated profit. That profit went to the man who owned her. He used that profit to maintain his lifestyle, to invest, to build wealth. If he had descendants, he might have passed that wealth to them. Which means the money generated by Lucy's exploitation might still exist in some form, might still be benefiting people today. Meanwhile, Lucy's descendants, if any survived, and if they could be identified, received nothing. No compensation, no inheritance, no benefit from their ancestors' suffering. This raises questions about reparations, about whether descendants of enslaved people deserve compensation for what was done to their ancestors, about whether people who benefited from slavery have any responsibility to make amends. These are complex questions without easy answers. But Lucy's story makes them concrete. Her body was exploited for 25 years. The profit from that exploitation enriched her owner. And the effects of that exploitation, the trauma, the family destruction, it was passed down to her descendants while the benefits went to her exploiter's descendants. Is that just? Should that stand uncorrected? Lucy's story doesn't answer those questions, but it makes them unavoidable. As we reach the end of this exploration, I want to return to where we started, to Lucy herself, to the woman whose name appears 23 times in that plantation ledger, each time marking another pregnancy, another child, another instance of her body being used for production. Behind those cold ledger entries was a human being, a woman who experienced joy and pain, hope and despair, love and loss, a woman who gave birth 23 times, who nursed 12 dying children, who was separated from 11 surviving children, who resisted at least once that we know of, who endured 25 years of reproductive exploitation, who may or may not have survived to see freedom. We don't know what Lucy looked like. We don't know what her voice sounded like. We don't know what she dreamed about or hoped for. We don't know what she told her children before they were taken. We don't know how she mourned the ones who died. We don't know if she ever knew freedom. We know very little about Lucy as a person, but we know what was done to her. We know she was forced to endure something almost unimaginable. And we know she survived it for 25 years. And that tells us something important about human resilience, about the capacity to endure, about the strength required just to keep living when everything is being taken from you. Lucy deserves to be remembered, not as a statistic, not as an example, but as a person who lived and suffered and endured. Her story is part of American history. The wealth generated by her exploitation is part of America's economic foundation. The system that consumed her body is part of America's past, and the trauma she experienced is part of the legacy that America still carries. If you found Lucy's story meaningful, if it helped you understand forced breeding at the human level, if it made the statistics and systems more real, then remember her. Share her story. Don't let her disappear back into the archives, because Lucy represents thousands of women whose names we don't know, whose stories weren't documented, whose suffering is lost to history. By remembering Lucy, we honor all of them. By understanding what happened to her, we understand what was done to them. By refusing to look away from her story, we refuse to look away from the truth of slavery. This was Lucy's story. 23 children, 25 years, one woman's body used as a factory, one woman's life consumed by a system that saw her only as a resource, one woman's suffering documented in a plantation ledger and preserved for over 150 years until historians found it and told her story. Now you know, and knowing means you have a responsibility to remember, to understand, to ensure this history isn't forgotten. Lucy deserved better than what happened to her. The least we can do is remember,